right? You have a very short window in which to be acceptably sad. And when that window is closed, then, people are walking around tapping their watches and looking at the calendar like, you got to get back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
And we're a product of our culture, right? We have this idea that quote unquote happiness is the same as being healthy.
Hey everyone, I'm Thais Sky. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women by women on conversations that matter. Hello everybody, Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim, the podcast. I am your host. And if you noticed, which you may not have noticed, I won't take it personally, but if you noticed, I didn't release an episode last week. I know. In fact, I have released an episode every single week since we started October of 2017, minus the break, a few breaks that I've had, and another break that is coming up at the end of May. I'm wrapping up season 2, and we're gonna have a little break before season 3. But besides the scheduled breaks, I have been posting for you all, every single week. And last week I didn't. I didn't. I felt, it was. I just wasn't able to do it with my schedule. I've been falling behind on interviewing guests because of my schedule, and I looked at my, schedule for the month, and I realized that I didn't have any interviews coming up that would make it to the deadline of having the episode live on Tuesday, and then I thought I'll do my own, like what I've been doing, but I feel like I've been doing so many of those back to back, and then I just got in my head, and I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna let it lie. I'm going to let it lie. I'm going to do this thing where I'm just going to release the need to be perfect. I'm going to release the need to be rigid in my scheduling. And it's interesting because so much of my perfectionism is this need to be a good person, right? Like if I release my episodes out every week, then all of you will know that I really care about you, that I'm a good podcast host, that I love my podcast. And if I'm inflexible or don't post regularly, then it means that I don't care about you. And I want you to know how much I care about you because I want you to love me, right? So that's kind of like the dynamic that's going underneath the surface. And I've been doing a lot of work of loving this dynamic and honoring this dynamic and understanding this dynamic over the past years. And so being confronted with either I stress myself out about this missed episode, or I just move on and trust and know that the people who listen to the podcast will respect that I needed that week off, then that's it. And let me tell you, giving myself space to be human has been one of the most amazing experiences of my life. I've been reflecting a lot on my 20s. I'm turning 30 in a couple months, actually in 2 months to this day, or well, not this day that it's being released. So anyway, in mid-June, I turned 30, and I've been reflecting a lot about my 20s. And I have to say, one of the things that I've really seen I've been able to navigate in my 20s is softening into myself. I used to have so much rigidity, so many hard rules about how to navigate the world. And being able to soften into myself has been such a tremendous gift that has come because of so much work that I've done on myself, so much of the internal work that I've done. And that's, I think, the antidote to perfectionism and to compulsions and to all the other ways that we attempt to regulate and alleviate our anxiety, is to continually meet ourselves where we're at and continually extend self-compassion to where we're at. Again and again and again, I've seen that to be the answer. And I know that it's very easy to see ourselves as a problem that needs to be fixed. And if only we were different in all these ways, then everything would be okay. And so I'm reminding all of you today, right now, in this moment, that you are not a problem that needs to be fixed. And that sometimes that thought can be comforting because it means that you have some control. And I just would like to remind you that it's okay to feel, that you are broken and need to be fixed. You're allowed to feel that way, but just know that the truth is that that's not what's happening. The truth is that you are, in your messy humanness, in your flaws, in your imperfections, the most astounding, brilliant human. And that even though things feel really heavy and complicated and dark sometimes, and you're running the same patterns again and again, and you're feeling really frustrated with yourself, if you can extend even just a dose of compassion to your hardships, to the things that you've done as a way to mitigate your anxiety, if you can just extend one drop, one teaspoon, that can be enough. That can be enough, because you are enough, right? You are enough. And so, okay, missed an episode last week, but I am back at it. In fact, I have some amazing guests in the next month or 6 weeks before I end season 2. So stay tuned. I mean, these guests are fire. In fact, the one that I have on today, Megan Devine, I have been working with her assistant to schedule her for 6 months. And I have been so committed to having her on my show that I'm like, I don't care how long it takes. We will figure this out, because Megan Devine is divine. Her wisdom on grief and loss, I think, is so important and necessary. And we've talked about grief and loss on the podcast a few times, and we will continue to talk about it, because it's an area of the human experience that I don't think gets enough attention. And so we don't know how to navigate it when we're there. And I'm actually not quite sure if I've talked about this before in the podcast. So if I have, excuse me. But, I did take a grief class in my grad school studies. And one of the things that we talked about is kind of this understanding that grief is, there's steps of grief, right? There's a cycle of grief, and it's called DABDA. And it's this idea that, first you have denial, and then you have anger, and then you do the bargaining phase, and then you go into depression, and then you go into acceptance, right? So that model, that concept of understanding grief is actually extremely antiquated. And the person who came up with that idea, that concept, was really only talking about it in a very specific realm. And it's become applicable. We've tried to make it apply to every level of grief. And that's just not the way it was meant to be done. So instead, there's another way that we can look at grief. And it's by this idea of looking at tasks of mourning. And this is in juxtaposition, like this is a different way of looking at it as opposed to stages of mourning, right? Like we talked about with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying, right? DABDA. That's one way to look at it. Then there's like this idea of phases. And there's like some people define it as 4 different phases of mourning. Or 5 different phases of mourning. But I really like this idea of looking at mourning as tasks. And I think that it's, while all of those different ways are valid ways of looking at the mourning process, phases kind of imply a certain passivity, like this thing that you just have to kind of pass through. And if you just kind of hang out, like you'll eventually get through the phases, where tasks is kind of much more in alignment with this idea that the mourner needs to take action and can do something to move through their grief. And so it basically sees that instead of it's something that you just have to pass through, it gives mourners and people who are going through grief and loss with a sense of leverage and hope that there is something you can actively do to adapt to the death or loss of a loved one or whatever you are grieving. And so, this idea that time heals all wounds, I think, in many ways is accurate, but in many ways, time is an illusion and it doesn't necessarily heal the wound. In fact, the majority of the people that I work with, they thought that they healed their wound because it's been so long since the initial thing happened. And then when we do deeper digging, it's actually that they've put a lot of layer of defenses over the wound. So time doesn't necessarily heal all wounds. Sometimes it has to be an action. Sometimes we have to participate in the healing. And so seeing as mourning as tasks helps us to now see like there are things that we can do. Now, I do want to also caution that the problem of seeing things as tasks is that it can be very problem-solving oriented. Like mourning is a problem that needs to be fixed, and here are the tasks of how I'm going to move through that. And I want us to really be mindful of this, because Well, mourning is a natural process of life, grief, death, loss, dying, the things that I've been talking about on the podcast with Rachel Rice, like these things are it's a part of life. And it's important that we know that it is normal and acceptable to be in mourning for as long as we need to be in mourning. So I don't want to approach these tasks as like things you got to do, like things you got to check off. So let's see if we can approach these tasks with like a loosely. Yeah. Like see them as things that we can do, because there are things we can do, but also honoring that in many ways grieving and mourning is also phases, and it's things that kind of we do just have to pass through. Okay, enough prefacing. So task 1 is to accept the reality of the loss. Okay, to accept the reality of the loss. And it's true that many times when we're navigating someone dying that was very close to us, we deny. We go through so much denial. We don't believe, we refuse to believe that the death is real. And so our invitation in this task is to really do what we can to accept that this happened. We don't have to force ourselves to accept that this happened, but it is a part of moving forward, is knowing that death is irreversible. So one way that we can do this is having ritual. Ritual is something that, we don't really look at anymore in our society. And I think we're really missing out on the potency of ritual and helping us move from one phase of life to another. And that's really what's happening when we're grieving a loss. So ritual is a way that we can be in this task of accepting, and that there's a finality, but also that it's very deeply spiritual. And so whatever ritual looks like for you, it could mean something like a funeral. It could look like something like planting a tree or spreading ashes. And, it can look in a variety of different ways, but really it's about steeping into ritual to support you in facing the reality of the loss. Okay. So the second task is to process the pain of grief. Oh, and this is a big one. Not everyone experiences the same intensity of pain or feels in the same way, but it's impossible to lose someone which we've been attached to and not experience some level of pain. And so this invitation is for us to hold the pain and to do what we need to do to hold the pain. So obviously what we like to do is to not feel, right? And then we try to circumvent this task by avoiding painful thoughts. We use thought-stopping procedures. We try to disassociate. We try to disconnect from the discomfort of unpleasant thoughts. We avoid reminders of the loss. We use drugs and alcohol. So there are all sorts of ways that we attempt to minimize the pain. And this is when getting support, surrounding yourself with people who can be with you in the pain. Anxiety, anger, guilt, depression, loneliness, these are all common feelings that we experience. And so working to being able to expand our container of holding this pain is important. And getting support, I say, is the best way that we can do that. Okay. And then task 3 is to adjust to a world without the deceased, without the loss, or adjusting to a new life, pretty much. We need to make external adjustments, such as if our significant other was paying on the bills, right, to adjust that. We also need to make internal adjustments about how we navigate our lives, and also spiritual adjustments. And making sure that we, instead of avoiding the pain, that we're adjusting ourselves to this new life. Okay, task 4 is to find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. So we're adjusting to a new life, but it's important that we find a connection, find a way to connect with whatever it is that we lost. And this is a lot about how can we stay connected to the person that we lost. Maybe by having photos, or if you lost your dad and your dad loved to play the violin, it would be continuing to play the violin. Right? It's finding a way that we can integrate that loss into our lives. Okay, and that's the final step. So it's really about finding meaning and purpose, and knowing that there is a way that we can move forward, not different than how we were before that person died or before that loss, but in an integrated way. Okay. So this is not my concept. This is from a book called Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy by J. William Worden. It's a handbook for the mental health practitioner. So none of this is my concept, but I wanted to share with you all because maybe it's helpful for you in evaluating how you look at grief and maybe seeing if you are navigating grief on some level, seeing what tasks you have completed and what tasks is still left to go, and what active things you can do within each task to continue to integrate the experience and move forward in a more holistic way. Okay, enough about me. Let me introduce you to Megan Devine. Okay, so Megan Devine is an American psychotherapist, writer, and speaker. A grief advocate and communication expert, Devine is best known for her 2017 book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand, and for her work advancing an approach to grief support that excludes the use of platitudes, the Kubler-Ross model, which are the 5 stages of theories I talked about, the ADAPTA, and treating grief as a pathology. Devine is the founder of Refuge in Grief, a grief support resource and online community which serves both grieving people and those looking to better support grieving people via free online resources, paid creative courses, and professional training. Refuge in Grief's grief education and outreach works to normalize the many physical, mental, and emotional effects of grief and corrects the notion that grief is a pathology and occurs in orderly stages. Devine's quotes, "Some things cannot be fixed, they can only be carried," and acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better even when they cannot be made right, defines her model of grief advocacy work based on her professional and personal observations on supporting grievers and their advocates with an emphasis on unexpected, out of order, traumatic, and accidental death, including death by suicide, violent crime, natural disaster, pregnancy loss, and baby loss. Okay, so Megan Devine is amazing. In the show notes are all the links to all the things, including her book. She mentions at the end of our interview that she does have some courses for clinicians on how to support people navigating through grief. So I highly recommend, if you're a clinician, mental health coach, teacher, healer, that you're interested in doing more grief work, that you check those out. And in this conversation, we talk a lot about grief and how to support people in grief and also how to support ourselves in grief. And so my question for you as you're listening to the interview is, what is your relationship like with grief? How have you found to be best supported in your grief? What are ways that we can support other people in their grief that we haven't done in the past? And what can a new relationship with grief look like where we can acknowledge that grief is here to teach us? Megan, welcome to Reclaim the podcast. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I don't know what podcast you're on, but I had a friend recommend your episode, and I was just so moved by your story and also by your work in grief. And so much of what you say resonates with my own experience of what I need when I'm in grief. And I think continuing to educate and talk about grief is something that I feel like is so important. And I guess I want to start us off by asking you, have you received pushback on your conversations around grief? Because I imagine that it's such an uncomfortable topic for so many people that there may be a desire, to not talk about it. Not talk about it. I'm saying like society not wanting to hear it and talk about it. And I'm wondering if you experienced any of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is yes. I think anytime you're in the public eye, you get pushback because everybody has an opinion, mm-hmm. right? You're breathing wrong, or your hair is the wrong color. Like we're just sort of an opinionated culture. Mm-hmm. But I love that little nuance that you picked up there with, I talk about things that make people uncomfortable. There's a reason why we don't tend to talk about grief, because it's uncomfortable and it's awkward, and it asks you to go places that you don't necessarily want to go. And sometimes rather than acknowledge your discomfort, you lash out at somebody. Mm-hmm. So I do get that quite a bit. And what I usually get from grieving people I usually get messages like, thank you so much for talking about this.
Mm.
It's about time. I feel so validated. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Mm-hmm.
From people who are doing their best to be supportive, I tend to get more, you need to cut people some slack. Stop telling
Mm.
support people that they're doing it wrong. Some of my favorite comments are, you're clearly not enlightened enough to understand the good intentions behind somebody's message. I love that one. Um,
Wow.
your discomfort makes you decide to shame somebody else. Good job. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the other thing that I actually get from grieving people and from people who don't identify as grieving, one of the pushbacks I get is I get told that I'm too angry. And I
Mm.
think that this is a really, really fascinating one. And this has to do with grief, but it also has to do with how we treat anger in the wider culture, especially for women or women identified folks.
Mm-hmm.
It's like anytime you are anything less than polite or submissive or extra careful with your words, you get branded as an angry person, and an angry person in quotes with the connotation that this is the bad thing to be. And, there's a section in my book where I say, I'm not being negative about these things. I'm telling the truth. And I think we get really confused
Mm-hmm.
that um, telling don't tell the truth if it's going to upset somebody. Don't tell the truth if it's going to ruffle somebody's feathers. Well, not telling the truth about the reality of our experience, about the truth of our own stories, about what helps from support people and what doesn't, not telling the truth about that stuff, or not being willing to hear the truth about that stuff, has created the world that we have,
Mm-hmm.
with increased rates of suicidality and depression and anxiety and interpersonal conflict and feelings of being socially isolated. You get that kind of a world when people are not allowed to say what's true without everybody else coming in and telling them that they need to be nicer, kinder, more polite, and quieter.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. And I see that so ingrained in the clients I see that who are coming in with depressive symptoms. They're even afraid to talk about things that they have been taught are negative, right? So at a very young age, they were taught that emotions like sadness and grief and, anger are considered negative, and in order for you to live a happy life, you have to be positive. But we're not often told in that narrative what we're supposed to then do with these quote unquote negative emotions, and how we're supposed to have a relationship with them. And so I think it's so interesting that you are getting those pushbacks, because I think that is so indicative of our own fear of what are we supposed to do with this pain. How are we supposed to hold this pain if we've never been taught how to hold it?
Yeah. And that idea that if your life makes somebody else uncomfortable, that's your problem, right? I'm sorry, my sadness is affecting your day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's that aspect in it too. And I love what you brought out, sort of shaming a natural human response. Like, what is that about?
Mm-hmm.
This frame that we put on things, there's some language out there that says, the dark emotions, sadness, pain, grief, anger, like those, what, right? Like, why do we need to name any human emotion as negative?
Mm-hmm.
They're just real.
Mm-hmm.
You can certainly use an emotional state in a weaponized way, right? If I'm stressed out and somebody cuts me off in traffic and I stop at the stoplight and I start banging on their vehicle, like, that is perhaps using my frustration in an unskilled way, but it doesn't make my frustration wrong.
Yes.
Right? So I think we can talk about that separation in there. But again, like, the only real images we have of, to stick to anger for a second, the only real images we have of anger is rage and violence.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we only get those expressions of anger when anger has been held back for too long.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to find a way to speak. And I think one of the big things to do is to first acknowledge that no emotion is a bad emotion. It's information.
Mm-hmm.
One of my old teachers used to talk about anger is a sense of injustice, right? It's information about a situation that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And then as grown adults and also as children, if you're able to apply skill to any emotion, to be curious about it, to ask yourself what you need in response to that feeling, That's beautiful, right? Anger is what fuels us to make changes that need to be, that need to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, I think about how someone may apply this, and I think that it feels doable if we're feeling like a momentary sadness. If we're feeling sad about something, I think let's extend our muscle here and practice holding the sadness as information and leaning on people. I think where things start to get really, really challenging is in the context of grief, because particularly like grieving a loss, I think we live in a culture that expects us to kind of get over it for like a certain amount of time, like whatever that is, like a week or a month or a year.
Yeah.
And if you're continuing to grieve or show signs of not adapting to the loss at the time that other people expect you to, there's almost like you're deficient, you're broken, you're not processing this correctly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. You have a very short window in which to be acceptably sad. And when that window is closed, then, people are walking around tapping their watches and looking at the calendar like, you got to get back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
And we're a product of our culture, right? We have this idea that quote unquote happiness is the same as being healthy, which is not true and not how most people live.
Mm-hmm.
And this impatience with other people's sadness. You see this not only in the grief community, but in the chronic illness or disability community, right? Like, why aren't you over that yet? Mm-hmm. How come you're not just thinking more positively and muscling through? You're strong. You got this. This idea that there is some measure of happiness that we are all supposed to not only reach, but maintain no matter what else happens. And what's funny is that, I get it. I get that we're all sort of soaking in this culture, and what we've been taught is exactly that model, that hard things happen. Yes, you get to be sad, you get to have your feelings, but you need to push through and get over it in order to be healthy again. Like, that's what we're taught. So in a way, it's not our fault that we believe that. However, it is our responsibility when we know different to do differently, right? To go, oh, well, this actually isn't working. It doesn't work with my own sadness to just tell myself to buck up and move on. And it doesn't seem to work when I look at my friend whose brother just died. And I, 3 weeks after the funeral, I'm like, dude, you gotta buck up and move on. Like, you're stronger than this. That doesn't work. Okay, then it's my responsibility to wonder why and to maybe make some different choices around that. I like to make that distinction between fault and responsibility because, we started out this conversation talking about how uncomfortable people can be around grief and how uncomfortable people support people when they feel like they're trying their best and it's not helping. It's not working. A lot of my work is to come in and be like, everything you're doing to support your friends is wrong. And nobody likes to be told that they're wrong.
Yeah.
But if you really want to be supportive of somebody, then you need to be willing to hear that what you're doing isn't helpful. If you're not willing to hear what isn't helpful, then you're not really interested in being supportive. You're interested in being a savior, and that's different. We see that in grief. We also see that in conversations about systemic racism or gender violence or all of these things, like giving advice about what we should do about these things, but not being willing to hear from the people who are actually on the ground struggling with those issues. Well, then you're interested in being a savior, not actually interested in the conversation about how we change things. So
exactly.
When I talk about this stuff as related to grief, I think it's important to remember that talking about all of these things, how we deal with emotions, how we respond to uncomfortable conversations, I talk about them in this really sort of tight lens of grief. But the principles, the process belongs to the much wider scope of being human. And how do we respond to pain? How do we respond to somebody's story when their story makes us uncomfortable? These are skills that we need all across life, including in grief related to death or loss.
I love that. And I love that you've connected the concepts because, I do that similarly in my work and here on the podcast, trying to demystify, I think so often we tend to think that, like, let's say anti-racism social justice is in one camp, right? And then our internal work is in another camp. And so there are a lot of people who focus on the internal work and they're not talking about the systemic issues. And then there are many people who are talking about systemic issues and not relating it back to themselves. And so marrying the two, seeing the connections between the two, and recognizing that they're both so interconnected and necessary for the healing of our planet. I love it. I'm so excited that you connect the two, because you're preaching my alley. Nope, that's not the way to say it. You're whatever.
I get so excited that the phrases get all complicated. But it's such a cool thing, right? Like, especially, it's not that racism or gender violence or violence against LGBTQ folks, none of that shit is new.
Yeah.
We're hearing about it, and the conversation about it is happening more and more because of social media, because people are waking up and paying attention and all of these things. And they're hard stories to hear. As a white, very privileged person in this culture, it's easy to get defensive. It's easy to feel like, but I'm not like that. I'm not part of this, which is not true. I'm in this culture. I am part of it. But to be able to apply the principles of how do we show up to pain? How do we deal with our own discomfort in the face of somebody else's story? And I do this every single day, and I teach this in realms of grief and loss and support. And when you practice those skills on an intimate level, when your friend whose brother just died, you're practicing your skills of acknowledging their story, acknowledging their pain, coming up underneath them and supporting it in the ways that you know how, and checking in with them to be sure that those things really do feel supportive. Those things on a personal level are the exact same skills you need when you're on social media and you're hearing a person of color tell their story of how hard it is to be in this culture. You note your own defensiveness and you go, right, I got this. I know how to listen and recognize that somebody else's story, the truth of their own story, feels uncomfortable to me. But my response here is not to take their story away from them. It's to listen. Like, such a cool skill, such a cool skill. And it also reminds me of, years ago, I did a podcast with somebody. We had this great discussion about skills that you need to show up for yourself and for others, no matter, what's hurting in your life. Great, beautiful conversation, full of skill building. And at the end of the conversation, the host says, so everybody listening, these are great skills to keep in your emergency toolkit. You probably won't ever need them, but just in case you do. And I was like, what did you just say? Oh my gosh. These are not skills that you put in your emergency use box in the basement along with your disaster prep. Like, these are skills that we need every single day. And just like any other skill, the more you use them, the more you practice them, the more your skill set increases and the more your confidence increases. I often say this to people who want to be supportive, whether they're professionals working in the professional world of support or, friends and family. It's like, you're going to feel awkward not cheering somebody up, right? It's an impulse. It's an impulse when you hear somebody in pain or suffering to either blame them for their situation because they're not trying hard enough to get out of it, or to cheer them up and try to make them happy again, right? Again, it's training. It's going to be a hard habit to break, but you can do it. So you're going to feel awkward as you break yourself of that habit of fixing things for somebody. And honestly, feeling awkward is a really great sign. It means that you're doing something new and doing something different. And that's what's called for. Yeah. Right. Breaking those habits of fixing things and making things better. Or telling somebody that the truth of their experience isn't actually the truth. It's a tricky thing to break those habits.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's because, we hardly know how to hold space for ourselves, let alone know how to hold space for other people and their pain without it making it be about us. And I see this so easily in the ways that we attempt to relate and have empathy with other humans. This is something that I've navigated and had issues with in the past. A friend shares their story with me, and I immediately go to, oh my God, me too. And this is my story. And while sometimes that can be helpful, and so this is not black and white, it doesn't mean never relate through or never have empathy through relation, but sometimes when we do that, we're actually then taking away from that person's experience. We're trying to relate something that has, nothing to do with what they're experiencing. And I think we do that because we want to connect, and that's valid and fair. And then sometimes I think we do that because we're attempting to alleviate our own anxiety about what they're bringing forth within us.
Sure. And I think, those are two really good points. And I would add one more. Because we don't talk about grief very much in this culture at all, I feel like we all carry some unspoken grief or grief that hasn't been heard enough. And it's like always looking for an entry point. Oh, good. We're talking about grief now. Thank goodness. Let me tell you a story.
Yeah.
Right? That's not necessarily terrible, right? We're not talking like all of this stuff is nefarious intent, but right time, right place. So if you run into a friend and you ask them how they're doing and they say, not that great. My sister just got a cancer diagnosis. And you say, oh my gosh, my grandmother got a cancer diagnosis when I was 9. Whoa, we just missed each other. Right? Right time, right place. I think where that gets tricky, and again, this is also a place where I get some hate mail or pushback or rough comments. That very quickly turns into a competition of grief in that example that I just used. Like, okay, wait a minute. I'm talking about my 36-year-old sister who just got a terminal cancer diagnosis. And you were talking about your grandmother who was 94, right? And what that devolves into is like, oh, you're saying that my 94-year-old grandmother wasn't important or as important as your, like, it just cosmic meltdown so quickly. Right? And I think that points back to, because we don't honor grief in this culture, everybody feels defensive about their own story.
Yeah.
Everybody wants there to be space and reverence and listening around their own story. And the thing is that every single grief is valid. There is no one grief that is more important than another, right? Your loss, no matter what that loss is the most important loss in the world for you. That's just true. So what we get into, though, again, because grief is so undervalued and so not listened to in this culture, when we hear somebody, again, we'll go back to my example here. Like, I run into a casual friend at the coffee shop and I say, how are you doing? And they say, not that great. My sister just got a cancer diagnosis. That is my practice point for the day. This is an opportunity for me to practice supporting without fixing and without hijacking somebody else's story. So that would look like, I'm sorry to hear that. Do you want to tell me about it? Or, oh, that's really rough. I hear that more and more these days, and I have my own experience with it. If you ever have questions, I don't know if I can help, but I'm happy to listen. What a beautiful way that is to communicate that you know the territory in your own experience, and also respect that person, one, maybe doesn't want to talk about it with you, and two, that their experience with this cancer diagnosis is going to be vastly different than yours. Right. And that doesn't take away from your experience. That's a beautifully respectful way to acknowledge the truth of somebody else's experience.
Yeah,
right?
I love that. It's consent-based, right? It's not assuming that they're going to want to talk about it with you.
Yeah.
Or, sometimes you're not in the proper setting where they want to talk about it.
Really bad place for personal, emotional discussions.
Yeah.
Really bad.
Yeah.
Right. And we always want to operate on the consent model, right? If I'm talking with somebody, my friends and I are all really good at this. And every once in a while I send them notes. I'm like, you are kicking ass on the support skills right now, right? Because these are skills and we can learn them and we can practice them. And, I think as humans, we really like to give advice. We have ideas and we have opinions. And the practice here is not to not have opinions or not have ideas for somebody else, but to always ask for consent and permission first. So like with my friends, if I'm wrestling with something, they know to say to me, like, I have some ideas about this. Do you want to hear them right now? And if I come back and I say, no, I just need to be pissed off, they're like, cool, totally happy to listen to it. Right. So there's a consent and permission here unsolicited advice is the scourge of our time. Everybody has a freaking opinion. I was actually speaking to a client this morning, and she was saying, you know, she got a dog after her wife died. And, you know, like a year after getting the dog, she's got different camps of friends saying to her, like, you know, I really didn't think you should get a dog. You're not ready for it. And then somebody else saying, like, it's about time you got a dog, right? Like, everybody's got an opinion about what you are supposed to do with your own life. The only person who is an expert on your life is you. Why people think that they need to tell you what you should be doing with your life is beyond me. If somebody hasn't asked for your opinion on their life, do not give it to them.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that we practice in I lead a group program, and we practice this, and every time I lead it, I always have someone who then holds back, who doesn't comment at all because they're so worried about what to say. And I think that is so interesting at how for so many of us it has been so ingrained to give our opinions, to give advice, that if we can't do that, we literally have no way of knowing how to now connect and relate to that person. And so what a beautiful opportunity to now learn something new.
Yeah, because I feel like that's the thing is if you're suddenly quote unquote not allowed to give your opinion, how are you supposed to communicate? What an interesting question.
Exactly.
What that says to me is you apparently only know how to communicate by talking at somebody with your opinions. That's interesting. Okay. Well, that's one way to communicate. What might be some other ways to communicate or to relate to somebody else? Curiosity is a great thing, right? What's that like for you? I would love to hear more about that. You can also, as we just suggested, you can ask for permission. I have some ideas about this. Do you want to hear them? I often, when I do keynotes or big talks, I often tell the story of my friend Beth, who got diagnosed, surprise diagnosis with stage 4 cancer when she was 36 or 37. And we used to have these long conversations while she was in the hospital. And she said, you know, I can't tell people that I'm scared anymore. I can't tell people, I can't have conversations with people in my close friendship circle about what I need to happen with my husband and my son if I die, because they freak out and they start telling me like, you know, I've read this study about broccoli. You just need to eat more broccoli, right? We sort of panic and we revert to that advice-giving, cheerleading thing rather than listen to what the person is saying in front of us. So like in that situation, a much better response would be, that is a really hard conversation for me. I don't like to think about the fact that you might die from this. But I love you and I'm here and I'm willing to feel really, really uncomfortable so that you can get your needs met around this conversation. I'm going to go get a notebook and a pen and you tell me what I need to know about caring for your kid in the hopefully unlikely event that you die. Wow. What a beautiful offer. Right? Yeah. What a beautiful conversation. So, you know, there's so much in there. Yeah. If you experience a lot of frustration at the idea or the concept of not giving other people advice, spend some time looking at that. Do you feel like that's the only way you can relate? Do you feel like you're in effect hobbled by not being allowed to give your opinion? What are some other communication or connection tools that you might add to your toolbox?
So something interesting happened to me just last week. I'm currently getting my master's in clinical psych, and I'm in my clinical training now. And so part of clinical training means that I have to be in something called practicum, which is a class in school where basically I have to bring my cases from my clinic into the room and talk about it with colleagues and a teacher, right? And this is the way that my grad program tries to ensure that we're learning what we're supposed to learn. And so it was the first day of practicum, and none of us had an opportunity to do our case presentations yet. So we were basically just going around and sharing how we're feeling about this new adventure of going into clinical training and stepping into this new kind of role for many of us of being a listener, right? Which is a skill that is kind of hopefully embedded in us if we're going into the work of mental health and psychotherapy. Anyway, so as I was sharing, Megan, I start crying, okay, because I was sharing something very vulnerable, something that I didn't even really know I had a lot of emotions around. And as I was talking, my professor is one of those professors that just has this face of so much love and empathy always that you just look at her and want to cry, sort of thing. And
Sure.
so start crying, like embarrassingly crying in front of like 10 other of my colleagues. And the professor responds by saying, I would love to, I know that you're not the only one having this experience, and I would love to hear from other people in the room how what you shared lands with them. And what was really, really interesting was that every single person who responded, there were 5 people who responded, gave me advice.
Oh, they misunderstood the question.
Yeah. So they...
Oh, damn it.
Yeah. They tried to take away my pain by comforting me, encouraging me, saying, it's okay, you'll figure it out. And, some of them had a little bit of that vulnerability of like, yeah, me too. And this is what's helping me, and I just felt...
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question. Did the instructor point out what everybody did?
No.
Because your instructor asked a very different question.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it sounds like from the story that you just told, correct me if I'm incorrect here, it sounds like the instructor asked other people to talk about how your experience related to them, wondering if they were feeling in similar ways. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what you just said is most of your colleagues didn't answer that question. Instead, they jumped in and tried to fix it for you. They jumped in as saviors.
Yes.
Instead of as allies.
Yes.
What a difference.
It's such a difference. It's a difference in a couple ways. The difference between I immediately felt an embarrassment, right? A shame, a sense of being alone. Like I just put myself...
Well, they told you were doing it wrong.
Yes. I just put myself out there, and now I'm being reflected that like I should just suck it up. And I'm very sensitive to advice because based on my own upbringing, advice always has felt very invalidating for me. And so to receive advice and to be seen by these people was vulnerable enough. And then to not be met in my vulnerability felt isolating. And I think there was a missed moment there. I think there would have been a really beautiful opportunity for the professor to have pointed that out. And I think it was just a missed mark because I think she noticed it.
I mean, that was a giant missed opportunity. I want to roll back here for a second. One of the things that I just heard you say was, I'm especially sensitive to advice because of my upbringing, and you named yourself as sensitive. And I just want to reflect back that everyone feels some kind of response or reaction to being given advice, because advice is inherently corrective and shaming. That's not about being sensitive. That's about being human. Nobody likes being told what to do. If I make a statement about something and somebody jumps in and starts telling me what I should do about it, the message underneath that is, you are clearly doing this wrong and you need my expertise in order to be right again. Yeah. That is, at its very core, a corrective, you're doing this wrong, problem solution statement. It is never going to feel good for anyone. Yeah. I like to reframe that as not so much as being sensitive, although you get to choose your own word here. I do like to reframe that as your early warning system, right? That is, when you feel like, their advice just made me feel like crap. Well, you're right on track, right? That is about them being very poorly skilled. And I think it was a missed opportunity because unfortunately, many of our clinical providers, medical providers, are not trained correctly. And I think that's a huge travesty, right? The fact that we get into clinical psychology or clinical counseling and still operate on the problem to be solved method. Pain is a problem to be fixed immediately. Here are the things that you should do to fix it. It is doing a great disservice to grieving people, to people wrestling with any kind of pain or loss or grief in their lives. And it does a gigantic disservice to professionals. Because if you come from that foundation, that any discussion or any story of pain that you hear, and anybody who walks through your door, if you're a clinician, everybody who walks through your door is carrying grief of some kind, or they would not be there. If you meet their grief as a problem to be solved and you come at them with your awesome tools and your skill set and advice, you are missing them. Mm-hmm. There is a place for suggestion. There is a place for tools. Absolutely. I'm a cognitive behavioral Jungian trained clinician. There are some really good tools out there. However, the very first job of the clinician is to hear someone's pain for what it is and acknowledge it.
Yeah.
The other thing that I really like in what your instructor tried to do there, props to them. You and I were talking a few minutes ago about trying to empathize with somebody by sharing a piece of your own story. Mm-hmm. And where is that appropriate and where is that not appropriate? So we've already talked about how that's not appropriate. Let's talk for a second about where that might be appropriate. I think the situation that you just described was a really elegant way to invite validation for you, and also to open up a wider conversation about how hard this work is. It is a hard thing to do, to be sitting in front of somebody else's pain, right? As a clinician, you feel, especially as a new clinician, but also as somebody who's been doing it for years, it's normal to feel daunted, to feel your own emotional story coming up, to feel overwhelmed, to sit there and feel like, I have no idea how to help this person. So these are all really normal things, and we don't talk about them enough, not just in the clinical field, but in lots of helping professions. It's important to talk about how hard this work is that we do. Mm-hmm. So what your professor was doing there, what the instructor was doing there, was opening up a really beautiful territory for relatedness. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the shared experience, empathy skill set there, I think that asking other people to share similar experience to what you had just shared was a really elegant way to open that conversation, right? Let's talk about how hard it is. Anybody else want to share a story of what it's like to be sitting in a room with somebody who's in so much pain? Those are really important conversations. I run a Writing Your Grief course pretty much every month for the last 5 or 6 years. And people come into that group, and what they almost always say is, this is the first place that I can tell the truth about my experience, right? And one of the really magical things about that group is there's no crosstalk allowed. Mm-hmm. So when somebody comes in and they say, like, here's my story, in the comments to that post, you're not allowed to come back in and say, like, oh, when this happened to me, mm-hmm. right? Crosstalk, hijacking a conversation, those sorts of things. They're not allowed to do that because each person needs to be allowed to tell the truth of their own story without somebody else coming in and sort of derailing the conversation. Mm-hmm. However, there is something magical that happens when you're in a group of 30 to 50 other people all carrying big losses and writing about them together. There's something medicinal. There's something incredibly powerful about seeing other people's stories and being able to connect to them on your own. Oh, I see myself reflected in that story. Oh, I never thought about this aspect of my own loss until I saw you write about yours. Mm-hmm. Right? So I'm not saying we should never share our own experience with other people, because I think that connection and that relatedness is incredibly powerful. Yeah. It is, however, right timing. Yeah. Right place. Yeah. Is this a time for my story, or is this a time for me to listen? Yeah. Right? If I feel like, because of the story that I've lived, I have something potentially useful to offer to this person, then ask if they're ready to hear it. Mm. Right? Mm. I think we go to this sort of black or white globalized thinking thing, like, you told me I can't give advice, so I'm not going to talk to you at all. Well, yeah. Okay, that's your choice, right? You can make that choice for yourself. And there are lots of different ways to connect. There are lots of different ways to support each other. What I'm really asking for is that we pay attention to the ways that we habitually interact and wonder, is that working? Mm-hmm. If my intent is to show my love and support, to let somebody know that I might have information that they might find useful. It's okay to communicate those things. You just need to ask for permission first. And you need to be willing to hear that what you're doing isn't helpful so that you can change your approach and actually deliver the help and support and love you most intend. And it's going to feel awkward.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. And I would love to hear, Megan, how to kind of navigate from the person who's experiencing grief, how to navigate this feeling of like not wanting to be a burden, but needing to get support.
Yeah, I think that's a really big one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Especially since, like we talked about at the beginning, there is this expectation that you're supposed to move through your grief in a specific amount of time. And if you're grieving longer than that, I mean, it's valid. It's valid to have an experience. It is your experience of how moving with grief looks like. And how then do we navigate the feelings of I can't reach out to somebody, like I'm going to tap out on my resources, like people aren't going to want to support me after a while.
Totally. So I was having this conversation with somebody just last week. So there's this thing where, like if I say, as a support person, you need to check in and see if what you're doing actually feels as good to the recipient as you hope it does. And, some of the conversation, sometimes argument, sometimes just conversation or questioning is like, well, I really need the grieving person to tell me how to help them. Like if they need to speak up, if something I'm doing isn't helping them. And you know what? That's true. It is on each individual person to speak up when something that's happening to them is not okay. And there are lots of reasons why somebody might not speak up. Mm-hmm. In grief, in chronic illness, in non-chronic illness, right, acute situations, there are times when you simply don't have the bandwidth to access, to identify what you need, what's going on, who might be able to help you, and then communicate that to somebody and hope that they say yes. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of energy. Sure, it's on the grieving person to speak up about what they need. And there's a reality here that when your life just completely dissolved and went sideways, figuring that shit out, not going to happen. So especially in the early days of grief, and early you get to define for yourself, but I think of that like really close to whatever just happened. Your support people need to be a lot more proactive than maybe they usually are.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, that's so hard. That's so hard.
Oh, it totally is.
And, as you were talking, I just remember when my dear friend was going through a miscarriage and, it meant many things to her and she was processing the grief. And I asked her, what can I do? What can I do to support you? And, she was like, I don't know. I don't know what I need. So never mind, never mind.
Exactly. And so one piece about that or one suggestion in there, I mean, of course you ask people what they need, right? We just spent like 15 minutes saying you have to get permission and consent from somebody. So, it gets a little bit complicated and convoluted. So it's okay to ask somebody, just be aware that they probably will have a response like your friend did. You can also draw on what you know of your person. You can say things like, I'm not really sure how to be of best help for you. Here are some ideas I have. Can you tell me if any of these things will work for you?
I love
If not, and you have the bandwidth and you know what you need at any given time, let me know and I'll see what I can do. Yeah. So you're taking some of that labor off of your person at a time when they just don't have the resources to communicate with you in a way that maybe you're accustomed to.
Yes.
Right? That the more specific you can make an offer, the more helpful it is to your person.
I love that.
So that's a really great thing. There's another piece in here though that, if I don't like what a friend of mine is how a friend of mine is talking to me, it is on me to say like, that really doesn't work for me. That's a really hard thing. Like I would feel much better if you would just come over and take the recycling out and I could really use this and this. But think about how hard it is to have a conversation like that when everything in your life is going pretty well. Mm-hmm. Who does that? Mm-hmm. Right? Who is like so cool with interpersonal skills and communication that they will always have those sorts of conversations with their friends on a normal, ordinary Tuesday? Mm-hmm. Those are hard relational skills. So asking somebody who is grieving or is ill or going through some massive challenge to identify and use a relational skill set that you don't even use on your best Tuesday is unrealistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's the cure for that? Well, the cure for that is to start practicing these communication skills when nothing is hugely wrong in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So that in the event that things go sideways, these skills aren't new to you and to your people. You can have these kinds of conversations with your doctors, with your therapist, if you currently see one, with your friends and family, right? The time to prepare for how to deal with shit falling apart is way before it falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about this, we've touched on this several times in our time here together. Like, you have endless opportunities to practice different ways of connecting and different ways of communicating with your friends and your family and the people around you, right? Endless practice points, because there is so much pain in the world. From the tiniest things to the biggest things, there is no shortage of places where you can practice responding to things differently and try it out.
Oh, I love that. And I feel like that's going to resonate with so many people, and such an important reminder. And I just, such a big admirer of your work. And I know that you're rolling out with some courses for clinicians who are hoping to do better work in the grief realm. And I would love to hear a little bit more about that. And then also any other final thoughts you have around, I know you have many thoughts around the conversation of grief, but any final thoughts that you want people to leave with today?
Yeah. So for grieving people, and you can identify grief however you'd like, anybody who identifies as carrying grief, there's a really, really wonderful, pretty much monthly course called Writing Your Grief. And it's a 30-day writing course. And it's honestly one of the best things that I've ever created. It's pretty magical. I call it the Acknowledgement Laboratory, because it's a place where people get to tell the truth of their own experience and have it witnessed and received and honored in the way that it deserves to be. And it's really nothing short of magical. So that's a really cool thing. And then for clinicians and other people in the helping professions, this year we're rolling out 2 training programs. One longer certification training program for clinicians and people in the medical professions, to really dive into, what does it mean to listen to people's pain? What does it mean to show up for grief, and how can we do it differently? It's going to be a really, really cool program, touching into cultural reasons why we respond to grief the way that we do, institutional reasons, and what needs to change both in the culture and in our institutions and in our own practices, just to make things better for grieving people everywhere, and to feel like we have the skills to meet the things that life asks of us. And then a shorter, more intensive sort of weekend thing for people in the helping professions. And so that's going to be medical people and clinicians and first responders, anybody who deals with grief and loss in their sort of daily professional lives, to be able to respond to that with skill and grace, and to really change the way that grief unfolds for the people that we cross paths with. So some really, really cool stuff coming up soon.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Final thoughts.
I think all of this stuff can feel really overwhelming for both grieving people and people who are trying to be supportive. So the only thing that you really, really need to remember is that grief is not a problem to be solved. It's an experience to be tended and witnessed and supported. And if you come from that place, support folks and friends, if you come to that place knowing that the pain that you see in the people around you, in your personal life and in the wider world, your job is not to fix that pain for them, but it's to companion them alongside it. You're going to do fine.
I love that. Thank you, Megan, so much for your beautiful thoughts today. I'm going to link everything into the show notes. So if people are interested in learning more about you and your amazing work in the world, you can learn all about Megan in the show notes. I appreciate you. Thank you for the work that you do. And yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.